Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Science Friday Book Club. I am your host and the Senior Manager for Experiences for Science Friday, Diana Plasker, joining you from New York, where it's officially spring here. Our trees are blooming, and we're very excited to see it. So, thank you all for joining us, no matter where you are joining us from. Speaking of which, we want to know, where are you joining us from? A few people have already started to let us know in the chat. So I hope that if you're able to, just sign in with a YouTube account. It should just be a Google account, and you can let us know where you're joining us from. We've got people joining from New Jersey, Portland, Oregon, Rochester, New York, Atlanta, all over Denver, Tucson, Salem, Oregon. Amazing. Thank you all so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to spend my evening with you. Well, if you don't know us, I like to say that Science Friday is your one-stop shop for all things science news. We are best known for our weekly radio show, which is broadcast every week on, you guessed it, Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can listen to us live on our website by going to sciencefriday.com and clicking the listen banner at the top of our page, or your local radio station, whatever works best for you. But today we are here to talk about this month's Sci-Fi Book Club pick, which is When the Earth Was Green by Riley Black. Got it right here. I've so enjoyed reading this all with you so far. Riley takes us deep into the Earth's ancient history, vivid landscapes, and creatures that make the prehistoric world come alive. As per usual with Riley's writing style, the writing is immersive and deeply descriptive, and it really feels like you step back in time walking through the ancient forests. It sparked so many great conversations in our community space about evolution, climate, the twists and turns of life on the planet. And if you want to join us there, you can go to sciencefriday.com/book club to find out how to join our community space. It's hosted on a place called Mighty Networks, and we'll post a link in the chat so that you can follow us there and become a member. A kind reminder before we get started, Science Friday is committed to providing a welcoming and harassment-free environment for members of all ethnicities, ages, gender and trans statuses, sexual orientations, physical abilities, national origins, belief, and any other dimension of diversity. We've created a code of conduct, which you can read in its entirety on the community space I just mentioned. It helps us create a safe and positive community experience for all. And here are the basics. Be supportive and respectful when speaking with one another and asking questions in the chat. Share generously and listen closely. You can add your thoughts or ideas throughout the conversation. Maybe you love the specific part of the book, or you have a question for our expert. We'll be looking for those as soon as we get started. We're going to do our best to stay on topic. We are here to discuss this month's book club pick and closely related topics. And we do reserve the right to ban anyone who engages in demeaning, discriminatory, or harassing behavior in the chat today. So thank you for sticking with me. And I think that we are about set to go. So in the chat, if you wouldn't mind putting your, emoji that expresses how you feel about this person joining the stage. It's Riley Black, everyone. Hello, Riley. Welcome to the live stream.
Hello, Deanna. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's so nice to have you. I'm going to properly introduce you now. Riley Black is a widely recognized expert in paleontology and the award-winning author of several books, including My Beloved Brontosaurus, Written in Stone, When Dinosaurs Ruled, and The Last Days of the Dinosaurs. She's a science correspondent for Smithsonian and regular contributor to publications like National Geographic and Slate, and she's based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Black is the author of this month's Sci-Fi Book Club pick, When the Earth Was Green, Plants, Animals, and Evolution's Greatest Romance. And it is so excited. It's so exciting to have you here tonight. Thank you again.
Oh, I'm so glad to be back. I had so much fun with The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, so I'm sure this is going to be great.
One of our favorites. I quote a lot of facts from that one too, and I think this one is being added to my various. Did you know there was a Cretaceous resonance interval? But we'll talk more about that soon. So if you have questions, audience, if you have any questions throughout the evening, you can post them in the chat, and we will do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. But Riley, I have questions for you. So can we start by you just telling us a little bit about how you landed on plants for this book. Was your love for plants kind of mixed in with your love for dinosaurs, or did you discover it along the way?
I think there are a few different factors that led to me writing this book in particular. One of which is every morning, one of the first things I do after the cats wake me up and I take care of them and get them to stop screaming for breakfast is to take the dog for a
Classic.
walk. And we walk for about 3 miles. And during that walk, I love places that have lots of trees, lots of flowers, the neighbor has a lot of front gardens and things. And I just love to stop and see what's growing, what's new, like, track through the year, like when snowdrops start to come up in February, or when those little grape muscari or hyacinths start to come up in March and early April and stuff. Like, that's the stuff that I'm waiting for. I love seeing the changes and just all the different critters and creatures that are interacting with these plants. So that was a big influence, is just kind of seeking out those little bits of nature, even around the city here. Part of it was because there wasn't really a good popular audience book about fossil plants. Dinosaurs and stuff, there's tons of books about them, and I've certainly contributed to that. But we wouldn't have the dinosaurs that we know and love without the botanical record. And I feel like there's been a growing understanding that we need to think about our favorite prehistoric animals, not just in terms of themselves, but the environments in which they lived. So that was another reason that kind of pushed me towards writing it. And the last one was that I didn't know as much about fossil plants as the animals. I'd always be fascinated when I'd be in the field and I'd find a fossil plant, often while looking for the animals. And the experts that were out with me there, usually vertebrate paleontologists, they were looking for dinosaurs and proto mammals and things like that. But I was always fascinated by the plants we'd find. What did they say about what that environment was like? So those three things together, sort of the sense of familiarity and that there was a need to tell these stories, and it would give me something new to do, that this wasn't just kind of digesting and explaining stuff that I've been thinking about for 15 years, but had some novelty in it, some new places to go. It really solidified that this was the book to write.
I love that. Yeah, and boy, what a trip down prehistoric times it really was. Um, when we first picked this book, as you can probably imagine, and you probably got this when you were first announcing the book, we got a lot of when the earth was green, what is it now? So I'm going to give you this
Uh-huh.
opportunity to set the record straight. Um, the earth is green now, yes. But
Mhm.
why did you land on when the earth was green, talking about plants from prehistoric time and their relationship with the animals they coexisted with?
So a little bit was that I had an initial title in mind that wasn't quite working for the publisher. I wanted to originally call this book Understory, to say it's the story of plants, coming up from the bottom. I thought it was evocative, and it was also a bit of a reference to one of my favorite games, which is Undertale, and I wanted to kind of do it for the nerds out there. It wasn't quite clicking, so we had to come up with something else. When the Earth was green, it felt evocative, and much like the last days of the dinosaurs, I would get comments about that. It's like, well, dinosaurs are still around; they're birds. It's like, yes, they do cover this in the book.
Yes,
It's
yes,
just a way
yes.
to get people's attention. So I felt like when the Earth was green, it was this evocative kind of sense, and I think there is a bit of truth to it. This is a little bit of artistic liberty, of course, but the world was more green, that we have cut down and deforested a lot of our greenery on this planet, that we're trying to figure out how to grow things amongst the societies and the cities and places in which we live. So I wanted to kind of get readers to think about a time before all the stuff that we're familiar with, that even just the very idea that forests used to be different, that when we look at like a woodland or something now, that is not necessarily how things were 66 million years ago, 100 million years ago, what have you. I point this out all the time. I know it's a big shocker, Jurassic Park lied to all of us, but it's contributed to this idea
Dang.
that dinosaurs live in these sort of humid jungles, right, like thick lush plants and everything else. They would have hated it, and they would have pushed over trees and eaten a lot of vegetation, trampled down the ground, spread seeds around a different way, so that the forest would be open. There'd be a lot of sunlight that was hitting the understory, a lot of growth kind of at the base of those trees, because the sunlight was able to reach it. It was really only after the mass extinction 66 million years ago that forest, where you had multi-tiered thickly growing forest, Earth's first rainforest afterwards. And that's a whole chapter in When the Earth Was Green as well. So it was kind of getting at this idea of just think about the forests and the greenery that Now imagine if that wasn't just something in the background, but something that's changed as well. It has a whole other evolutionary story to it. And I feel like When the Earth Was Green as a phrase helps capture that.
I love that. Yeah, I was definitely not exactly surprised by your description of like the different ways that the trees were growing in these forests, but it is like you have to constantly, as someone who grew up with Jurassic Park, like just remember, like, oh man, it didn't quite look like that. It didn't quite look like that. It's a very different world. We gotta not like unlearn some of these things that um, Hollywood made us love dinosaurs, but we have to place them in the places where they would have existed as well. So well, so you write about the complex relationship between plants and herbivorous dinosaurs, and then, some of the carnivorous animals that also lived among them. Can you tell us a little bit about how those co-evolutionary relationships shaped both parties? Because you're really, throughout the book, really just hammering this home that they really, it's a back and forth process. It wasn't these giant dinosaurs saying, like, plants, do this thing for me, and then they did it.
Absolutely. I'm going to grab a little visual aid from off my shelf here to help illustrate
We
this point.
love visual aids. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, my office is full of dinosaurs and other critters, so this can help.
I wouldn't
So,
expect it any other way.
yes. So this is a rendition of our familiar friend Brachiosaurus, from the late Jurassic. Has the classic sauropod body plan, right? So the tiny head, the really long neck, the big body, the tail to counterbalance all of that. Why is the dinosaur shaped like this? This is something that we don't think a whole lot about often. It's just like, well, they're big, they're weird, they're reptiles or whatever. They have their own evolutionary trajectory, of course. But dinosaurs like this are shaped this way because they evolved to eat as many plants as quickly as they possibly could. Now, the reason, the push behind this, the evolutionary nudge, was that, this animal in life, if you've ever been to the Field Museum in Chicago, you've seen a life-size skeleton on the outside, or even I think in O'Hare in Terminal B or something like that. They have the skeleton there. It's a huge animal. It's, some 80 feet long or so, multiple tons. But it hatched out of an egg that was about the size of a grapefruit. So basically, if you're a baby Brachiosaurus or Apatosaurus or whatever sauropod you'd prefer, you're more or less like Jurassic popcorn to the carnivores of the time. The only safety that you're really going to get is if you grow very, very quickly. And what do you do to fuel that growth is you eat a lot of plants. And through various studies involving paleobiology, kind of looking at the nutrition of conifers and horsetails and ginkgos and things like that, paleontologists have worked out that these plants were nutritious enough to build these multi-ton 80-foot long plus bodies through this plan where it's like there's no molars or chewing teeth in the head. They're just little pencil-like croppers, so they're just kind of nipping vegetation, swallowing it whole, and that long neck allowed them to browse high and low, side to side, like basically park themselves in a spot and just kind of munch at the salad bar as they pleased. So far as we know, no one's ever found a sauropod stomach, but we don't think that they had multi-chambered stomachs like a cow or anything like that. They're probably hindgut fermenters, much like elephants and other large mammals are today, and that is just expanding the retention time for all that green material, getting as much nutrition as they possibly could out of it. And that's why these dinosaurs are shaped like this. They had to get big very, very quickly to avoid predation. But the reason that they're shaped the way that they are is because of fossil plants. And it even changes through their lifetimes. When we look at baby sauropod dinosaurs, they have very rounded snouts. Snouts there correlate with browsing, that we see this in modern mammals, that they're very selective about their food, picking the most nutritious parts, fruit and succulent leaves and things like that. In the adults, their muzzles are squared off, much like that of a cow, or grazing animals that tend to eat low down, lower quality food, but a lot of it. And this physiologically makes sense. We see smaller animals often have higher caloric, requirements than bigger ones that like need to eat a lot of food, but it doesn't need to be as dense in that energy. So all these things factor together to create these magnificent animals that we love so much. So you can start at it from the paleobotany side or the dinosaur side or what have you, but I just love how all of these things fit together. It's really the creation of biodiversity, that there's not a dinosaur shaped niche in the ecosystem per se, but these relationships create these shapes and all these wonderful forms that we're just so fascinated by.
It was really fascinating to watch. What I love about your books is that you kind of give people a snapshot, right? So it's for this book, it's like, all right, we're going to drop you into 66 million years ago and then 30 million years ago, and we'll get like a quick day in the life. Um, and I feel like there were so many, you get this kind of quick succession of like we started out small, and then the plants got bigger, and then the plants got bigger. You very quickly could see that kind of like almost like race to get bigger. Can you talk a little bit about how that works in evolution and in relation to like plants in particular? What what were plants doing in relation to the animals around them just becoming bigger and bigger and bigger over these millions of years?
Yeah, I feel like the earliest growth of plants on land and the establishment of these early forests, what we think of as the coal swamps of more than 300 million years ago, is a great example of this. And that, plants evolved in the oceans, just like animal life did. And even when plants began to grow on land, these liverwort type things, plants that were very, very much reliant on moisture, not just to survive, but for their reproduction. When they started growing along the shoreline around 425 million years ago, uh, or more, there are already little invertebrates that were kind of scurrying along the tide line. If you ever seen like a mole crab or something like that, it's probably critters like this, these little millipede-like things as well. So there are already critters that are kind of eating the detritus and stuff that would wash up onto shore, and plants started growing there as well. And these invertebrates were like, oh, free meal. There's free food basically now everywhere as a reliable food source. And that started to nudge plants to grow in different ways, to form more resilient tissues and different forms of growth in order to basically not be munched into nothing throughout evolutionary time. For since the time that plants have been growing on land, their biggest predators are not things like elephants or giraffes or hippos or things like that. It's insects and other invertebrates. So you have these early plants growing on land. They're evolving more ways of becoming resilient and also growing taller. You have the evolution of these compounds like lignin that help add sturdiness basically to the plants, that they're flexible. They allow them to bend with the wind without breaking, but sturdy enough that they can start, it's kind of like skyscraper materials in a sense, like they can start building up and start building a forest. And that's one of the things I love through this book. It's such a simple fact, but like a tree is not an evolutionary group. A tree is just a shape. Many different plants take that shape, and some of the earliest ones that do, their living relatives, seed ferns and things like that, are very, very small today, but they used to grow into these trees that could be 100 feet tall or more. And on these trees, many of them, we call them scale trees from these coal swamps, that have this rough scaly texture, and even that bark was photosynthetic at the time. So it's a forest that would have seemed like kind of like oddly familiar. You'd recognize it as a world full of really big plants, but plants of all these different more archaic forms growing in different ways than we're used to. And that created this kind of feedback loop. If we talk about the ancient climate and how plants affected it, and the ancient atmosphere in particular, as we well know, plants take in CO2 and they build their bodies, build themselves with the carbon from it. The oxygen gets released. Most of our oxygen in the atmosphere is coming from these plants. And during the Carboniferous, the amount of oxygen in our atmosphere increased incredibly, it's 20% or more. And for a while, we thought that, okay, like this made it more efficient for invertebrates, these big millipedes like Arthroplura, the 6-foot-long rug of a millipede, basically, were
Very
able to get
glad it
so
used to
big.
live millions of years ago.
Yes, I think it would be cute, but then again, I like bugs. um, so we used to think that they could breathe more efficiently, right? And this is what allowed them to get so big. Now it seems that too much oxygen can actually be toxic, and larvae of these invertebrates, not just the big millipede things, but big dragonflies and things like that, um, got bigger to basically cope with this extra amount of oxygen, to not basically die from the toxins that would be involved in having that much oxygen in the atmosphere. And then bigger babies, you get bigger adults, which then that higher amount of oxygen could be a little bit of an advantage in terms of their breathing efficiency. So when we talk about these big animals, it's not just that oxygen was higher, therefore big animals. It's this complex back and forth kind of relationship that's constantly changing. And I think that's part of why I reiterate it so much in the book, is that when we think about evolutionary time and prehistory, it's often set out kind of as one thing follows another. This 19th century idea of progression, right? That the next thing is going to be better than the thing that came before. Very much Charles Darwin talking about this and On the Origin of Species, and sort of fitness and the newer thing is going to replace the older thing. Um, But I wanted to dispel that a little bit. And this isn't just a matter of stuff getting better or a certain kind of plant appears and it kind of sets that part of the ecosystem. We can like set that aside. Like all these organisms are, continuing to interact and evolve constantly. And I want people to look at the world around them and see that now. Like I can look out my window and see the trees, along my block really starting to leaf out for spring, and think of all the insects and other, the birds that feed on those insects and all these other living things that are interacting even now. It looks just like a tree out in the yard. It's not doing anything particularly interesting, but that single tree is an ecosystem unto itself, and those interactions are going on now, are continuing to shape what Earth's future is going to be. So I love getting the chance to do that with prehistory, to pick these moments of interaction, say like, okay, I know we're jumping around through time periods and organisms and stuff a lot, but what this is really about is those relationships and how they shape each other.
We got some great questions from the audience. We're going to start at the very beginning. You talk in chapter 1 about these Bangomorpha, I think is how you pronounce it, but you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. But Fran has a question about the evidence for these red wavy things, which I think are the Bangomorpha. Can you tell us a little bit about
Yes.
how you start in chapter 1?
Yes, the little red threads, which if you have the audiobook, I love the way that Ren Mac reads it. They did a fantastic job with the narration on that. So our evidence for this, we actually have the Bangomorpha fossils. This is something, early life is often very contentious. There are a lot of things, cellular structures that we find in very ancient rocks over 1 billion years old that, sometimes there's debate, is this something mineralogical? Is this just a pseudo fossil? But we do have actual Bangomorpha fossils that show plant anatomy. And this is some of what I talk about in the books, where the earliest days of sexual reproduction amongst plants and the different forms that they take throughout their life cycle, even though they're very, very tiny, microscopic. So in the reference section of the book, I list some of those papers, which I think some of our open accessors should be able to find on the web. But we have the actual microscopic little red threads preserved in that rock. And it was kind of a challenge to write about, because most of the rest of the book, it's at the macro level. Even when we zoom in close, it's stuff that you can see with the naked eye in one way or the other. In writing about things that are almost microscopic, they're just so tiny, that just seem just like a little bit of fuzz, on the sand. That's why I put in that moment of kind of, with every breath, think of yourself getting a little bit smaller, almost like a guided meditation kind of moment, because that's how little so many of these stories started. It's the origins of this important group that would fundamentally change the planet, started off so small that you could barely see them. And I think it's fantastic that we've been able to find them at all. Imagine the planet as big as it is, and we're able to find those tiny, tiny microns tall threads that, so far as we presently know, kicked off so much of what we see around us now.
I will be honest that I read that chapter while I was at a spa, and I was like, perfect. This is the perfect way to start this book. I was like, I couldn't have picked it better, honestly.
Oh,
Um,
fantastic.
yeah, I've got a question about the illustrations. And so you have worked with this artist before for some of your other books, and I just like I want to point out one of them because there were a few that really like delighted me. Um, but tell us a little bit about the artist and what it's like to kind of work with someone to, pictorially show some of the very specific relationships that you're trying to talk about in the book.
Yeah, so the artist for this book, as well as The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, is Corey Bing. And she's a friend and a fantastic, fantastic artist. We had actually met at a furry convention years ago, and I was passing by, the booths in the dealer's den where everybody's selling the merch that they make. And Corey was making, on her own, books about convergent evolution and homology and prehistoric life and stuff. And, we started, corresponding and stuff here and there. And when I came up with these books, I knew I wanted illustrations in them, and I wanted somebody who's experienced with prehistoric life and who shared that affection for them. That like I knew that the artist would get this right. I wouldn't have to do a crash course on prehistoric anatomy, that we're kind of speaking the same language. And so I immediately thought of Corey, and I really wanted to throw this project to her, and she's thankfully said yes. We're actually going to work on a third one together that we're wrapping up this year. but all that experience, that shared affection for prehistoric animals of all sorts, not just dinosaurs, but the saber-toothed cats that you see in there, and working through fossil plants together and saying, okay, what would this look like? Like, I'm saying catnip, but would it look like modern catnip, or would it look like sort of something a little bit different, or like how do we reflect that? It was just phenomenal. Corey is a great artist, and I think that she nailed just about every illustration in one go. The only one that I can remember there being like a little bit of back and forth about was in the chapter on the earliest flowering plants, the earliest angiosperms. There's a bird in there called Yeholornis, and I mean, leave it to Corey. This wasn't necessarily my request, but Corey's like, I really want to get this bird right. I feel like I got something wrong about like the teeth, the feathers, or something like that, and went through a couple iterations of it. But it was honestly fantastic. I sent the prompts over to Corey, and I think she just about nailed all of them in just about one. And I think it really shows in the artwork that we were kind of sharing a brain cell for what some of these should look like.
That's awesome. I love when you can find someone that can really kind of complete the project as opposed to like just like kind of stack something on top. I think that this illustration was one of my favorites of the
Yes.
Apatosaurus or an Allosaurus. This really perfectly illustrated to me that thing that you were just talking about earlier when you showed the dinosaur of them like plucking and swallowing whole, and it was just a thing I hadn't considered before that that was something they might have done. So it was a really great illustration to show exactly that.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that we have a lot of things, like some of which focus specifically on the plants, some of these moments of interactions. I love the one of the book right here. Let me see if I can find it real fast. But in the chapter about how early monkeys rafted to South America, just the look on that early primate's face
Yeah.
is just like, oh my goodness, like you poor thing, and just like, but that's what I wanted, and I'm happy in a sense. Like, I don't necessarily want to make readers cry because of the book, but I've gotten some
Hmm.
responses that like a sticky situation, the chapter on the Cretaceous resonance interval, that some readers have cried because of the fate of that poor
Oh,
mosquito and what I put her
yeah.
through. And honestly, like, yeah, it's a tricky one as a writer, but I that was part of the point of this exercise in empathy and getting people to connect to other forms of life that we often might think of are in the background.
Hmm. This is the illustration
Yes,
that
yes,
you're
yes.
speaking of.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh. It's
Thanks for
just
pulling
like,
it up.
yeah, I had the same emotion where I was like, oh, I like opening the page and being like, oh no, what is this poor little primate going through?
But they make
I
it.
wonder, they make it. It's a really, it's a spoiler alert, they make it. How they do it and exactly why it's possible is part of the book. Let's stick with our first chapter a little bit. We've got Dorothea who's got a question about lignin. So you were talking about lignin, the structure that helps make um, plants more rigid and eventually leads to trees. Um, but it acted as a sunblock for this Bangomorpha. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mostly included that little bit about it because, like, when I was learning about paleontology, ages ago in my own prehistory, the idea was that lignin evolved to, as a structural support mostly, and it kind of set up this idea that like there's almost like a need for it. But of course, we know evolution doesn't work that way. It seems now that lignin initially evolved as a way to protect plants that were beginning to grow on land from UV radiation. You can kind of understand how this would work, that you have plants that are starting to grow on the shoreline. They're constantly under the sun. Those that are better able to cope with that UV radiation and the other aspects of growing sort of in a more exposed space, they're going to reproduce more and kind of pass that trait along this early form of lignin, which then can be adapted further and has other properties, because what in evolution is ever doing just one thing, right? So much of anatomy and biochemistry and stuff, there's multiple functions or potential functions for each of those parts, and those that lacked that protection wouldn't make it, or would struggle a little bit more. So I don't know as much about the biochemistry of it as perhaps I would like to. Have always struggled with about organic chemistry a bit, but as far as I understand, that's one of the wonderful things about this particular compound, about lignin. It's what I call an exaptation, and that it's something that was already present in these early plants and had this unexpected advantage. And by allowing those plants to grow along the shoreline, it could be adapted further to building some of these early forests.
Yeah, you constantly remind us of that in the book too, right? It's just like, remember, evolution doesn't have a plan. It is just trying a bunch of stuff and seeing what sticks because it helps things survive, and that's how it goes. And it's a good reminder. It's nice to see all of the different versions of how that kind of plays out throughout the book. But
Yeah.
as oh, go ahead.
That was something that was important to me. I think it comes through in that early chapter on liverworts as well, where so often when we talk about some of these big changes, it's often the invasion of the land by plants or fish, or the colonization of the habitat, or the dominance of the dinosaurs. We use a lot of colonialist and imperialist kind of language in paleontology without thinking about it. And that was part of the shift, is not just the lack of a plan or a set end point, but in recognizing some of our own baggage that we bring to these visions of the past, and saying, what if instead of thinking about sort of like conquering and dominance and the reign of whatever organism over another, we think about relationships, and just even in our personal lives, how much relationships, just being in them, changes the people within them. Those relationships change over time. It's the same thing when we're thinking about evolutionary timescales. And yeah, that just felt like a very critical and central thing to keep coming back to.
Yeah, it really showed through, and it really helped me having read, a few of your books, and also a lot of books about dinosaurs throughout the years. Just think about those landscapes differently in a lot of different ways. But what does research for a book like this look like? Do you do like site visits to the past? I mean, like what exactly are you researching, or how are you going to places and looking at them differently?
So I've been fortunate enough to be a professional science writer for about 15 years now. And through that time, I'm constantly running around visiting field sites and museums and interviewing experts for different stories. Um, a lot of this book came from just previous, one-off scientific discoveries that I'd remember and then say like, oh, this is really cool, or this is really interesting. So the chapter, A Sticky Situation, about the Cretaceous resonance interval and like what amber really is and how amber fossils form, that came out of a specific paper identifying and naming this resonance interval. And I thought, this is fantastic. I need to include, I never knew that, it was so consistent for so long. Or, the chapter about, monkeys rafting between continents came out of reporting on multiple stories when those fossils were found. And, what was once thought to be like just this one just very lucky break actually happened multiple times, might have happened quite a bit. And we only had a couple of groups actually make it and survive on ancient South America. So being basically somebody who follows so many of these stories, I kind of picked a lot of this up over time, and it really became a matter of selecting what time periods and what phenomena I wanted to talk about. There's a chapter that I owe to my friend Bethany Brookshire, who's another science journalist. She asked me at one point, it's like, well, when did autumn start? How old is that? It's like, I don't know. I never really thought of
What a
that
great
before.
question. Yeah.
Yes, that's a fantastic question. I, looked at the scientific literature, and it's something that's, it's assumed that, this happened at some point. It's probably more ancient than we understand. But finding direct evidence for basically what we call senescence, the leaf senescence, is very, very difficult. But there's a site in Germany from a few million years ago that has leaves that, basically preserve some of the autumn colors. It's, fossil evidence of autumn. And that's why that chapter is centered around it. So once I kind of identified the kind of interactions I wanted to talk about, found my players, it really was a matter of trying to find as much research, as much technical literature as I possibly could. To fill in those spaces. Some, like the chapter on the apatosaurs, I didn't need very much at all because this is kind of something that's been bopping around my head for so long. But some of the other ones, like the chapter on prehistoric catnip, it was just like an idea that I had that grew into a chapter. That was an area that I didn't know as much about. And part of the fun in just writing a book like this is thinking like, this is a really interesting interaction. How does that work? How does that happen? So most of this was just done from my desk, based upon site visits, museum visits in the past. But a lot of it was a matter of sitting here and really trying to think through, like, what would it be like to be in these environments, not just in terms of time, but sort of what temperature is it, what time of day is it, what season is it, what kind of critters would I see around, and kind of building the scenes out this way. And I feel like a lot of my imagination is very influenced by the movies I watch. I'm a big movie fan, and films, whether it's Alien or Mad Max Fury Road, films with like just great cinematography, I think really influence how I wrote this book, just where I wanted to pull the focus. Are we looking broad at the landscape? Are we looking close up at something? How does this move the story along? So that technical side, and then just being able to basically, for lack of a better term, play with my dinosaurs. That's kind of what it's all about. We do all this research because we want to imagine what these animals and these plants are like. And putting those two together really made the book what it is.
Well, speaking of imagining what these plants and animals were like, we have this question sent in advance from Andrew, and I'm going to let him ask it.
Hello, this is Andrew from Albuquerque. Riley, would you consider feeding your detailed descriptions into an AI video generator so visually oriented people could behold the ancient world?
What do you think, Riley?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. So I'm going to give you a two-part answer. The first is that, like, at least at present, I'm fundamentally opposed to generative AI. It's an environmental nightmare, and creative works are made by people. So I would hire somebody like Corey. I've actually thought about this before. What would a graphic novel treatment of When the Earth Was Green look like, or a series of films about it? I think there's so many great visuals that could come from this, but it's important to have a point of view to tell the story, not just kind of construct the scene, but think about how would we see and experience it as people. And I'd want to help another artist do this. I think this is something that's very important in my own creative endeavor, is that I want to throw work back to the communities that I'm from, and from people that adding things to their portfolio would be a big help for them. So I've certainly thought about the visuals, but I would want to do that as a project with somebody. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, it's much more dinosaur focused and plant focused, but there are some graphic novels like Ricardo Delgado's Age of Reptiles that he did for Dark Horse Comics ages ago, or Rex Tooth Studios comes out with a number of prehistoric themed books, mostly about carnivorous critters, but some others as well. There's just so much fantastic paleo art and ways to reconstruct these scenes. So fingers crossed that someday I'm able to kind of adapt this into something a little bit more visual. I feel like the book is almost kind of like a very rough script or a screenplay for what this could eventually be.
That would be very cool. I bet a lot of people would kind of like be racing to the theaters to watch that. It seems like that would be a really cool thing to see. Um, let's keep on talking a little bit about sort of like how you developed your writing style. John's got a great question along those lines. They ask, enjoyed reading this book and your last one, like Last Days of the Dinosaurs, also a Science Friday book club pick. Thank you for writing it. You create an engaging, dramatic narrative when you write. It's unusual for books on paleontology. How did you develop that style?
So there are a couple other books in the past I'd seen authors and paleontologists employ before. So there's, of course, Raptor Red, which Robert Bacher wrote a number of decades ago. Prior to that, Edwin Colbert, who is another American paleontologist, wrote a book called The Year of Dinosaur that focuses on what we then called Brontosaurus and the year in the life of that animal. So this kind of tradition of paleontologists envisioning the animals and kind of having fun with it has been around for quite some time. And part of my urge to do so is like, I've been writing about the history of the science and the research and how it's done, how the sausage gets made in terms of paleontology for quite a while. I would like to play with my dinosaurs. I miss that feeling of kind of being a kid in the sandbox and getting to imagine what they would do and what their world was like. Making the shoebox dinoramas was always one of my favorite things to do, where you'd pick a prehistoric scene. Of course, there'd always be a volcano or something in the background. But I loved that sense of bringing all this stuff together and getting to recognize some of the things that we don't know, or that we can only infer from the outside. That every time we visualize prehistoric life, it requires our imagination, whether we're doing it in a scientific way or just for fun. And I really wanted to indulge that a little bit. And I feel like so many books on paleontology are often written from a place of authority, in a sense of, professional paleontologists and PhDs who, rightfully so, are very proud of their work, and they want to share how they found those fossils, how they told that story, what we know now, and kind of giving you the authoritative view of the field. And it just felt like time for something fresh, something a little bit different. Whereas, like, I don't want to just explain fossils to people. I want to write. I want to write something that invites readers in, that focuses a little bit more on empathy, to say, okay, this is what I see, or this is what we know. What are you interested in? What do you see? How would you, what would you look at in this ancient environment? What connections can you see to the modern world today? So I felt like it was a good way to shake up, my little pocket of the science writing world a little bit, to do something that had been done before, but really try and bring people in, and also explain the science. This is why each of the books has an appendix where I really lay out, this is how we know what we know, this is what's inferred, this is what's speculative. And yeah, I think I really wanted to help inspire other people to start looking through time in this way. It's something that I love doing, that whenever I am, going through a forest, or even out in the field and looking at the remains of the ancient environments, in the rock itself, imagining what it was like, and all these little connections that we can either see or are too small or too broad for us to see. Yeah, that I like thinking of these books kind of as me sharing what I see, and using it as an invitation for readers to do the same.
I highly recommend the appendix, by the way, to any readers who didn't get there or didn't realize that they were there. It's great for, like you said, you create these dioramas, you let people sort of look in, and then you're like, okay, now you can flip to the back of the page, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we got to know this thing and where these fossils came from or when this was discovered. I think especially for our audience, they really appreciate it. So thank you for doing it. I often get asked, do you consider the fact when you're picking a book if there's an appendix? Because I really like having appendixes, and I didn't until people really started asking for them. So thank you in advance for anything else that you write that has appendices. Jan does have a question though. Why didn't you add an index, glossary, or more pictures to this title? Because Riley, appendices are not enough. More, please.
Let me see. I thought we had an index. Let me see. No, we didn't. So some of those are
Can't have it all.
some of those are publisher decisions. It's something that's just, I am not an index maker, and I very much appreciate the fact checkers, the index makers, all the people who make books possible, who do all the stuff that my brain just cannot handle sometimes. So I think that was a publishing level decision, and something to talk about as I continue writing. And I imagine a glossary would be helpful. I had to more or less create one for the audiobook version, how many of these things are pronounced. In terms of illustrations, it was primarily budget. This is something that, like, I hear often about, books about prehistoric life, and I certainly understand the desire to have more illustrations in, and I certainly would have loved that. A lot of it came down to just what the budget could bear. I wanted to make sure that Corey got paid, and got paid well for her work, and it felt like doing 2 illustrations per chapter was suitable for this, without making it feel like it was too much of a picture book, because I did want people to kind of get a sense of these organisms, but also use their imaginations a little bit, or maybe look them up online. I feel that's one of the things that I enjoy quite a bit. Not everybody has to enjoy books the way that I do, but I love learning about something new, going for a search about it, looking it up, and falling down that rabbit hole. So I think the next book that we're working on together is going to have a few more illustrations, but I've always meant them to be more a matter of emphasis, or kind of an introduction to our main characters, rather than something that's comprehensively illustrated. But if I eventually get to, one of these other adaptations that we were talking about a moment ago, then I think it's going to look rather lush as a matter of course.
I love that. Was there a particular plant that really surprised you? I didn't know about the Cretaceous resinous interval, where the several tens of millions of years, where the trees were just making a lot of resin, and so we get a lot of amber with little creatures inside of it from this time period. I didn't know that. I just thought, like, that probably happened for the whole time, and it's probably still happening now. but probably not. It's super interesting. Yeah, I'm just curious, were there any like plant species or moments in time as you were writing that you were just really surprised or delighted by?
So the resonance interval was one of them. That was definitely something that I was very excited to learn about. I thought it was fascinating. And so often we think of amber as just kind of like, oh, it's perfectly preserved. Again, the Jurassic Park version of this, when it has its own basically fossil transformation. Um, Another couple of examples. One comes from the Ice Age chapter, that's right before the conclusion, involving ghost pipe. That this particular plant that does not photosynthesize, it has this ghostly white color, and it has a relationship with a fungus on tree roots, and that's how it gets its nutrition. And paleontologists and paleobotanists have been able to see how this plant more or less like retreated as the glaciers expanded during the last glacial maximum, and then worked their way back up the latitudes on the east coast of the United States. And I think that's fantastic that you not only have this plant that does something almost no other plant does. It's a non-photosynthetic plant, which is amazing that it even exists, but that it kind of tracks the expansion and retraction of these major moments in climate history. And catnip as well. Like catnip is obviously so familiar to many of us with feline friends. I'm kind of surprised none have come to stamp all over the desk as I'm talking to you now, but giving some to my kitties at home, made me think like, well, wait, like how far back does catnip go? And when I looked up the research, I was surprised to find that, it's well over 10 million years, and that it seems to have evolved its, basically active abilities, more than once through evolutionary time. And this overlaps with the time period in which saber-toothed cats and other forms of prehistoric felines were, going through this big evolutionary burst. So even though we don't have direct evidence of this relationship, who knows, maybe someday somebody will find a saber-toothed cat coprolite or gut contents that includes prehistoric catnip in it. It still was a great way to highlight this kind of interaction. I just love the fact that something that's so familiar that we don't even think about has its own fossil record that goes back, millions and millions of years, and likely affected prehistoric species just like it does, our favorite kitties roaming around our house today.
It also makes you like appreciate and seek out those things if you might happen upon them. I've seen ghost plants in my daily life here and there, and when I have in the past, it's only been since I started reading about them, and so it's one of those things that now I have the words for what that is and what it can do and why it's cool. And we got to look at this. Let's take some photos. I'll bring them back and I'll show it to my coworkers. And they'll be like, yes, yes, another thing that you saw. Sounds good.
Yeah,
But yeah, it really makes you look at the world differently.
yeah, forgive me if I'm wrong. I think at the beginning you showed a flower because it's springtime in New York, and it looked like a magnolia flower.
We're very lucky to have
Yeah,
them, and they're
yes.
one of the ones that goes way back.
Yes, yes, the earliest magnolias that we know about are about 125 million years old. So they show up about the same time as the oldest known angiosperms. And magnolias that are more or less modern, like I did a fossil project once, involving categorizing them a little bit. From the same time as T-Rex, they look like magnolias just grown in the yard. So now every time this time of year, especially when I pass a magnolia tree, I sometimes like to stop a moment and think about something like a triceratops or a little toothed bird, or another little pterosaur or something like that interacting with that tree. It feels like a little invitation to kind of think through time a little bit, and how fantastic that is that there are plants around now that like weren't growing during the time of our favorite non-avian dinosaurs, but the same species or something very similar is here. It didn't make it into the book, but one of my favorite stories involving paleobotany involves metasequoia, what we call the dawn redwood. So it's a plant that was named from fossils first that grew during the Cretaceous, it grew during the Eocene, it was thought to go extinct sometime in the Cenozoic. And I think it was in the 1930s, a Chinese forestry official was kind of doing a survey and found living metasequoia. Is out in a woodland, and this is basically like finding a living Tyrannosaurus, only it's a plant. And it's just so wonderful to have these direct connections, that there are parts of our ecosystems around now that have these long established relationships with living things and have lived through all these different climate and atmospheric changes in rainfall and everything else, and they still have a place to grow in. And I love that about evolution in general, that, like the world that we see around us today, every living thing has an evolutionary record, has a fossil record. Some have changed quite a bit, some haven't changed all that much, but it's all these things together, the old and the new, that create the world as we know it.
Another one of the things that you talk about in the book that I really loved was the specific things about plants that make them, different about animals when we're thinking about the pressures from evolution that make them do the things that they do, which is that they can't move, really. Like, they're stuck where they are. They're rooted in, can't really go anywhere. Animals have an opportunity, whether good or bad, to move about the earth more than plants do. And the ways that they make these different evolutionary changes to solve for that problem is super interesting.
Yeah, I love that, for example, ginkgo trees, at least our modern day species of ginkgo, it's a little harder to tell for the fossil ones, but they have the starch organ. Basically, it's like a plant savings account, so that if the tree, above should die or suffer some like calamity, it has resources to grow anew. And I, speculate in the book, like I wonder, given how old ginkgos are, if this might have been something that evolved in response to just having so many mega herbivores around for so long that, it might have been a common occurrence to get toppled over, have all your leaves eaten or something like that, and require this kind of backup plan. Yeah, it's so neat to me, like the ways that plants communicate as well. So that's what I was grasping for. This is something I feel like we're still just beginning to really understand. It requires thinking of plants as organisms in their own right. That they're not just window dressing, they're not just in the background, but thinking about questions that, like, how does a plant like experience the world? And we know that when plants are being munched on by something, and I have a chapter where there's a Megacerops, this big rhino-like mammal, is munching on a hackberry tree, and we know from modern day hackberries that they're able to kind of send the signal to other hackberry trees that they can pick up on to know to like increase the tannins, within their leaves, that they can sense vibrations as well from being fed upon, and grow in response to that, or kind of shut off certain branches and send those resources elsewhere within the plant itself. And they're much more interactive, I think, and have this dynamic relationship to life around them. So even though that they generally can't move, except for like aquatic plants that can float or what have you, but for the most part they're rooted where they are. All these sorts of like workarounds and defenses and ways to communicate that I think we're really just starting to get an insight into. We're just learning to think like a plant.
I love that. Speaking of which, we're almost at time somehow, Riley. I don't know how this keeps happening, but after exploring millions and billions of years of Earth's botanical history, what message do you hope that readers take away about our planet's future?
I hope that readers look at life around us now and think about all the little interactions that allow those lives to exist and potentially thrive. That at this point, we are the gardeners of this planet, whether we like it or not. It's such a basic and fundamental point, but nature is not something that's, out there somewhere. There's no such thing as a pristine wilderness kind of untouched or uninfluenced by people. Even ocean ecosystems that we might never physically see or rarely even get to visit are influenced by changes that we make to the climate, and what we're putting in our waterways and into the air. So with all of that in mind, it's not just making spaces for plants and living things to be, whether that's in a national park or even in your own front yard, planting for pollinators and local wildlife, but that life is everywhere, and we have a role in shaping it in big and small ways constantly. So my biggest hope is just for recognition of that basic idea that we can move with intent and make better choices to foster all forms of life that we live amongst, because we really never know what's going to survive and thrive in the future. What the next century, 1,000 years, million years of humanity gets to see it is going to look like. So my biggest hope for the book is is cultivating that sense of interest and empathy, thinking of these not just as landscaping, but as these wonderful lives that have their own deep and intertwined history with ours, and how we can better make space for them to live alongside us and continue to create the world that we all exist in.
Well, thank you for writing it. I mean, it was just such an enjoyable book to read, and I think our readers really loved it too. So, and thank you for being here tonight to talk about it.
Oh, absolute pleasure. This is something that, like, if you told me at the beginning of my career I'd one day be writing a book about fossil plants, I'd say I don't know anything about plants. How am I going to do this? And I'm just so
Yeah.
glad to bring this to life, and that you all have enjoyed it so much. It really was a pleasure to share.
We do have one more question before we depart, though. Ellen is wondering what book you're working on now. If you can give us just a little hint into what you're deep diving on next.
Yes. So it's already under contract with St. Martin's Press. This is the same press that's done The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, When the Earth Was Green. I feel like I'm going to have to come up with a series title because it's another narrative book in a similar tone. The working title is Tyrant Lizard Queen, and it's going to be about the life of a T-Rex from the time that she hatches through adulthood, really taking all that we've learned about this dinosaur, the most researched dinosaur that there is, and really bringing this prehistoric world to life, not just talking about, chomping other dinosaurs, although there will be plenty of that in the book, but, things like, how did a T-Rex sit down? How did they sleep? What kind of social systems did they live in? What kind of environment allows a 40-foot long, 9-ton predator to evolve and exist for 2 million years? Really trying to take all of this wonderful knowledge that we've accumulated over the past century plus and write it kind of as a love letter to probably the most famous dinosaur that there is. So I'm hoping the draft is due in August, so hopefully it will show up in 2026, if not sooner. But that's going to be the next one. It's going to be an exploration of my T-Rex, which I've nicknamed Snaggletooth, and her life in the world that she finds in Cretaceous Utah.
That's amazing. I can't wait to read it. I've never thought before about how T-Rex sits, so I'm excited to find out a little bit more what it was like. That's super cool. Well, good
Yeah,
luck.
thank you.
Yeah. And thank you again so much for being here, Riley Black, the author of When the Earth Was Green, Plants, Animals, and Evolution's Greatest Romance, based in Salt Lake City, Utah. And it is the Sci-Fi Book Club pick for April. So we are still reading together. If you want to join us, sciencefriday.com/book club is the place to go. And we hope we'll see you there. Thanks again, Riley, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Always wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good
Bye.
night. Bye.